Okay, good morning, everybody. So it's my pleasure to introduce Summer Mersinger. Thank you so much for joining us today. CFTC Commissioner. She was unanimously confirmed by the Senate, sworn into office March 30th, 2022, and on my birthday, February 26th, 2024.
I did that on purpose.
Thank you, yes. Was unanimously confirmed again for a second term that ends in April 2028. She's one of 5 CFTC commissioners at the CFTC right now. Prior to that, she served as Chief of Staff to CFTC Commissioner Dawn Stump. And if you are following the news, you probably saw that Senator Thune is going to be the new Senate Majority Leader on the Republican side. And the CFTC Commissioner that's with us today has worked in Thune's office, I believe, from 2004 to 2016.
Well, and I was in his house office before that.
And you were in his house office before that.
That was my first job out of college.
Yeah. So some good familiarity there. And just looking forward to a great conversation today. Welcome. And I think I want to start with a question about kind of one of the contested issues in this latest election, which was around regulation by enforcement. Most people in our industry, when we think about regulation by enforcement, we think about Gary Gensler, rolls right off the tongue, what the SEC is doing. But interestingly, the CFTC has run into a little bit of this concept as well with regulation by enforcement. And you were the first to write a dissenting order that actually used that term in the case of Uniswap. And I'd love you to explain a little more about what you saw, because a lot of times people think about the CFTC as the friendly industry, friendly regulator wherever we want to go, where Bitcoin and Ethereum is. But in terms of how that agency at least is sort of being led as well, leads to this topic of regulation by enforcement.
That's a great question. And I do have to give a quick disclaimer that the views I share today are my own, and they're not necessarily the views of the CFTC or my fellow commissioners. So, yes, the CFTC has also been guilty of regulation through enforcement under this administration. Certainly not as obvious as it has been at the SEC. I think the first time I did mention it was in the Uniswap case, but even before that, we had a very novel case that the agency brought against a DAO, and we kind of decided that we were going to treat a DAO under state law. We're suing in California, and so we put forward an idea that this was a corporation or association of some sort. Never been done before. First time this was litigated, and I really started to get uncomfortable with this idea that we were kind of setting some sort of policy through our enforcement cases and through going to court. And to me, if how you're going to treat an entity, that's a policy question that should either be decided in Congress, or if you have the proper regulatory authority, that should be decided through notice and comment regulation, and instead we were using the courts. So that's where I first started seeing this, and we kind of continued into the DeFi space, where we would say, if you have a DeFi protocol and you're offering certain leveraged tokens that fall within our jurisdiction, we're going to charge you as though you were, one of our registration categories. Sometimes we would say, you were a futures commission merchant, or you were a contract market. But we would bring these charges, yet there was no way for anybody to ever become one of those registered entities at the CFTC. And to me, again, if you're going to say in a case or a settlement that you are acting as a registered entity, you better have a way to let that entity register. And if you don't do that, you're saying, you're making a policy decision through an enforcement case. And this is really tricky in settlements, because the information we share publicly with our enforcement settlements really doesn't offer a lot of guidance for anyone who's trying to do the right thing. And that gets us into Uniswap, which I know we're going to talk about, a little bit further, but certainly that was a prime example of somebody who took what they could from one of our enforcement settlements and tried to do the right thing, and almost by doing the right thing, they set themselves up for our enforcement team to knock on the door and say, hey, we're going to also bring charges against you.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting about Uniswap, because what we saw happen in that case was a player, Uniswap, trying to follow the tea leaves of what regulation by enforcement was saying. They had looked to prior cases at the CFTC and saw that they shouldn't be offering some crypto derivatives. So Uniswap actually did the proactive right thing of taking the crypto derivatives off and unavailable. And then I believe with then what happened was we saw what you mentioned in your dissent was a bit of what basically unfairness, because then Uniswap still got in trouble for the time that they were offering it, right up to the point that they stopped it, which is when the CFTC said there was a problem. I think maybe this goes to the essence of the challenges of regulation by enforcement. Maybe it's just not the best way to, treat a market.
Yeah, it's not the best way to treat a market. And at the agency, at CFTC, we've always tried to be kind of out ahead on innovation, allowing innovation in our markets. We were one of the first agencies to have kind of a technology office. It was called Lab CFTC, where we let innovators come in and explain what they were doing, and we would work with them if there was, any area where maybe they were crossing into regulated territory or things they needed to know about regulation. We would have those conversations with them. It was, it was a safe space to talk to government. And, my experience with Uniswap is they were always very open. They wanted to talk to us. They wanted to work with us. And they were rewarded with they took the tokens that we brought in another settlement off their platform. They weren't the ones offering it. It was someone else offering it on their protocol, but they did the work of removing those. And our enforcement team came in and charged them with offering those tokens during the time period before we had put out our public notice. It was also an interesting settlement because it was a very, very small fine. And it was so small that, we rarely see anything under, even under $250,000 fine. That's really unusual. And this was a really small fine. And so to me, you could tell that even our enforcement team didn't feel totally convinced that Uniswap did anything wrong. And so it was very unfair that they did the right thing. They were proactively following what cases we were bringing, what settlements we had, and we still went and charged them. And then again, we were charging them under some novel theories of, how should they be registered, even though, again, they weren't the ones offering the tokens. We charged them as though they were the ones offering the tokens. So again, it just creates kind of a mess of regulation that the whole point of having notice and comment regulation is so that it's, people understand, you can get feedback from industry and the public, and you can write rules that are clear and transparent. And when you're using enforcement to create precedent, it's not transparent at all. It's not always clear, and there's no guarantee that we're going to treat entities the same across these enforcement cases.
One of the things I think that would be helpful to the audience is to understand how the CFTC might be most effective, governing the space with the market structure. And obviously that would be something that would probably have to come from Congress, which would be sort of the regulation of the spot markets. The first sort of thought I would have is, do you think the CFTC would be ready to regulate this very new market? And also, what would this mean maybe for stablecoins as well?
Yeah, absolutely. When people ask if the agency would be ready, we are a small agency, and I think sometimes in Washington people think small agency, they don't have enough resources. I think that is the wrong way to look at it. We're small and we're nimble, and we do a lot with little. So when you go back to looking at the Dodd-Frank Act, the entire swaps market, was unregulated, and they brought that all into the regulated space, and most of it came under the CFTC's jurisdiction. The thought was that our agency was going to expand twofold. We did not. In fact, Congress cut our budget for years after that. Mind you, at the time, Gary Gensler was the chairman. He had some big ideas for the agency. He was not successful, and in fact, Congress was a little disappointed and said, you know what, we're not going to give you as much money. But we have been able to adequately regulate that market, despite the size of it and despite how small the agency is. I think the same can be said for crypto. I think we're ready. We understand markets. We are market regulators. We have principles-based regulation, so that means, we let the markets decide how to best create the regulation. So, we may say, your market needs to be free of conflicts. We're not going to tell you exactly what that means, because that's going to mean something different to every market. But we are going to make sure you meet our principles, make sure you are doing what needs to be done so those individuals in the market are protected and it's fair. And it really has set us up, I think, as the ideal regulator for cryptocurrency spot market. And we also have that track record of we can do a lot with a little. We can move pretty quickly as a small agency. And I think that's what's needed here, especially if we get that jurisdiction from Congress. We, again, have a track record to prove that we can implement major legislative changes fairly quickly in our agency and do so without disruptions to the market. So the markets continue to operate, they continue to flourish, and we're able to layer on regulations that don't stifle the markets but allow them to continue to be liquid and vibrant.
Well, obviously this would mean, right, some work by Congress to do, and I think there's been the FIT 21 legislation we've seen, as well as, other, like the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, people looking to do this, but, maybe this is even a bipartisan issue, right, where we've seen the current administration identify a gap. One of the gaps they've identified is this not regulating the spot markets and something that should go to the CFTC. From your perspective, what is your opinion on this gap, and do you have any thoughts on the legislation as to how they might empower the CFTC?
And that's a great question, and for me, I'm a very conservative individual. We are a bipartisan commission, so at any given time, there is a mix of Republicans and Democrats, and with the president, you kind of flip the majority. So right now, we are a majority Democrat commission. We will become a majority Republican commission under a new administration. But, again, as a conservative, it is a little uncomfortable to say we need new regulation, we need new law. I've always kind of said, that's not my first instinct to say we need more laws and we need more regulations. But we do in this space for a number of reasons. One is to actually make sure that there's some clarity, because what we're seeing right now without those laws is you have agencies like the SEC who can come in and create chaos and bring charges, where maybe it doesn't fit. And so right now, having law, that defines who's a regulator for a spot crypto market is very important to make sure you don't have government agencies kind of going rogue and enforcing laws that don't fit the market. So that's one of the reasons I think we need, some sort of legislation. I think the other thing we see a lot at our agency is there's a lot of people losing money because they are getting caught up in these scams. And there is a real interest to be in these markets. People want to invest their money in cryptocurrencies and tokens and stablecoins, and not everybody knows where to go to do that. And unfortunately, when you have that interest and you don't have a safe space, people will start to go wherever they're convinced to go. And so we see these massive fraud cases where people are being told their money's going to be invested in crypto and someone's just taking their money. Our chairman talks about how much money we are bringing in cases that are crypto scams. I don't like to call it crypto fraud because there's no crypto. Nobody buys any crypto. They just take somebody's money. I mean, this is the latest version of fraud. And so my feeling is once we have jurisdiction, once we can, register safe markets and have safe places, those individuals who really want to buy and sell cryptocurrencies will know where to go to have the protections that they deserve in the market, and they will be less susceptible to a lot of these frauds that we're seeing, and hopefully that'll start to die down because having a registered safe place for people to invest their money will give them that outlet that they're looking for.
Interesting. So I'm a former regulator from the FDIC during the financial crisis, and to shift gears a little bit, but it applies to how regulation might work in this space is the notion of decentralization. And you had mentioned earlier about the sort of the case with the DAO, and I think it was the Oki DAO case. Yep. And one of the things a lot of like crypto regulatory lawyers brought up, which is an interesting scenario, was the fact that this was a DAO that was served through a chat box, right? The enforcement action, which kind of brings you to the point of if you have this decentralized infrastructure, there isn't a quote unquote CEO, like how do you go about regulating that space? And I think that's a really good example of some of the challenges that are faced. I'd love your thoughts on that and what your theory, philosophy is around how do we approach this very new technology, particularly from the decentralization aspect.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you start to get into the levels of centralization, and that gets real tough. That gets really difficult. And Oki DAO, the service process, the way they served on that DAO, I think was again unfair. I think it also disincentivized governing token holders from being active in, kind of the governance of a DAO. And so I think there's some unintended consequences there. And unfortunately, in that case, the DAO was actually created by two individuals who were already in trouble with the CFTC, and they were trying to get themselves out of more trouble by creating this DAO. And then, unfortunately, those token holders were, ultimately held liable for acts that they really were unaware, were kind of occurring. And so that was a very unfortunate case. But, it got me thinking about this idea of, okay, how do you apply liability when you have a decentralized system? If you're a governing token holder, you want people to exercise those rights and maybe they're going to do the right thing instead of, the bad activity. And so you don't want to disincentivize somebody from being an active participant to, in those protocols. And then when you look at DeFi, you have to ask the question of, did somebody create this protocol that allows somebody, a different actor to come on and trade, buy and sell something that might be might fall under a jurisdiction, but is that the fault of the creator, or is that the fault of the person who's buying and selling that token? And that, to me, is a policy question that we should not be thinking about and, kind of putting out our thoughts through enforcement, and that's how we've been doing it. And one of the things that has really bothered me, it goes back to this registration idea where we will bring these charges and say, if you're going to buy and sell these tokens, you need to be registered as one of our markets, one of our market participants. But we've never said how anybody could do that through DeFi. And that these are very centralized systems, and so even being DeFi and saying you need to register as one of our market participants or one of our market structure pieces, that would cause a great deal of centralization that is completely opposite of the idea of DeFi. So it's difficult to, kind of decide what the best path forward is, but I think continuing to use enforcement is not the right way to do it. This might be an area where Congress needs to step in and say, set some, even definitions here I think would be helpful. What is truly decentralized? If you have certain degrees of centralization, when do you become no longer DeFi and something else? that shouldn't be up to the regulator. That really is more of a public policy discussion for Congress to decide, and then we can implement based on their thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the energy usage of Bitcoin, and we've had a lot of conversations yesterday about this with proof of work, it sometimes is not discussed enough about maybe how some of the load balancing works and the way it's benefited Texas, where you actually have an industry that turns on and turns off, the energy. Now we have AI. We heard about from former Senator Pat Toomey, there's from 3 Mile Island in my state in Pennsylvania, there's one of the reactors that didn't have an accident that Microsoft just purchased as a sole customer, for AI. So there's not just Bitcoin that's using energy, but also Bitcoin has this flexibility to it. One of the things that caught me off guard, was seeing the chair of the CFTC, Rawson Benham, which you write dissenting things, so I'm not should be fearful about criticizing him a little bit, but he kind of came out and he said, when he started talking about cryptocurrency, he said, I really like Ethereum and proof of stake models, and it was a really good thing Ethereum shifted from proof of work to proof of stake, and it almost felt like he was maybe picking winners and losers, and also Bitcoin is the largest cryptocurrency by market cap that's regulated, and so we all heard about ESG, but it seemed like a little bit of pressure on the Bitcoin ecosystem about the energy that's used. And of course, in Europe, in MiCA, we just saw how they are now looking at every blockchain and trying to do an analysis of how much energy is used by that. What are your thoughts in terms of just how a regulator should approach this marketplace from the energy perspective, and also sort of commenting on liking one sort of product versus another?
Yeah, no, those are two areas that I love to talk about. I actually we have advisory committees at the CFTC, and I sponsor the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, and I took it in a very different direction. My predecessors were looking at voluntary carbon markets. I took it in a different direction. I wanted to look at this idea of electrification and the fact that we are adding more and more load onto our electrical system, in the grid, especially intermittent load. So charging your electric vehicles, everything running rather than off of fossil fuels. This idea that this push to electrification. What does that mean for the electricity grid in general? And people really get hung up on this idea of energy usage in crypto mining or cryptocurrency, the underlying technology. But they seem to miss some of the nuances here, the way we buy and sell energy, the way we it impacts us as consumers is heavily regulated by the government, number one, but we have a lot of issues with this kind of on again, off again energy usage problem, and with renewable energies, that's all intermittent as well. And so this idea that that we are worried about how much energy usage is going into blockchain development or Bitcoin mining, that's energy that can come on, that's energy usage that can come online when we might have a lull. Nobody has really looked at it from an energy usage perspective. My hometown in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota, actually it's not even a town, it's out in the middle of in a field. There's a rural electric area, and they just set up a Bitcoin mining location. That is great news for consumers there, because that helps with the kind of off-peak time load, and they are mining for Bitcoin during the time periods where people aren't using as much electricity. So I think people misunderstand, or they don't want to talk about the nuances of the electrical system, and it's very confusing, and they just want to blame someone for too much energy usage. I think that's unfortunate. And then, you also get to the underlying technology. We should be technology neutral as regulators. We should not pick winners and losers. We should never say one technology is better than the other. That's not our job. Our job is to make sure there's a level playing field with our regulations, that people are following our regulations, and the amount of energy usage is nowhere in our statute. That is not our remit. We do not get to make a decision about one thing being better than the other based on how much energy it uses. So that's one where I think you've got to be technology neutral. You need to remember, where you fit in kind of the kind of macro sense. And if it's something, if you're going to come up with a very definitive statement like that, spend some time understanding what you're talking about. And that's been a big thing for me in this space, is becoming educated, learning more, talking to the people in the industry, and really, understanding what everyone is doing in the technology they're using so that I can be a better regulator.
Final question for you, because I think our time is just about up, is obviously we just had an election in this country, and we're seeing, Republican administration start to go through the period of transition, figuring out who's going to do what. You're obviously a Republican on this five-person commission, excuse me. So, for all those that made it here, thank you. I know there was a lot of late parties last night, but all of you get the sort of exclusive view now on can you just explain a little bit of what it's like in the transition, what people should expect, in terms of who the new regulators might be, and if you're a business, maybe you see this as a signal of now's the time to go, but do you want to wait a little bit? Just sort of from the regulator's view of seeing this, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely, it's a different side of the sausage making. Everyone talks about the sausage making and Capitol Hill and writing laws, but this is a whole, the transition is an interesting process because still have the old administration in place, but you're shifting to new people coming in, new ideas coming in, and so there's sometimes this desire by the existing administration to rush through rules or in our case, cases and stuff to get done before they're out. And a lot of times, there will be people trying to put a stop to that. There's a lot of discussion about who will be in charge next. At our agency, it's interesting because there's usually somebody who's announced an acting chair usually before they announce who might be nominated permanently. And that all comes directly from the incoming administration. They're making those decisions, real time. You probably have all seen news stories come out. Those are real-time decisions being made. So, what I would say to industry trying to decide, when's the right time to engage with the new administration, I think certainly you want to start talking to people as they are coming in, as leadership is identified. If you can talk to those folks, I think it's helpful so they know what's important right now to industry, and so that they're kind of ready to go day one. And certainly, once they are in that role, go in and knock on doors and go meet with whether it's a new regulator or a new member of Congress. If you can go in and start that education process early, I think it's really important because once people get in that job and they get going, it's harder and harder to find time to have those conversations. And, what you learn right away, it kind of sticks with you. So I would say to industry, go in and start having those conversations as soon as you know who that leadership, where that leadership spot is going, but also don't be afraid to start knocking on doors day one, because I think it's critical to start the education process from the start and not kind of wait until it seems relevant. Sometimes that's too late. You want to be in the door. I always say you want to be the one introducing yourself, not having them coming and knocking on your door and saying, let's talk about what you're doing. So you want to tell your story and meet with those individuals.
Great. Big hand for CFTC Commissioner Summer Mersinger.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.